Keith didn't hit those. He said, who did?
Good evening. This time we will call our budget session to order. And at this time, I will turn it over to our county manager, Brian Alligood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. It's nice to be in front of you again to present to you and all of you have in front of you your books, the fiscal year 24-25 manager's recommended budget. This is number 9 for us. Time flies. So as we did last year, I want to make sure we kind of go through the whole piece so that folks that may be the first time understanding or seeing it, we get a little better understanding of how we do our budget process. So in the binder that you have in front of you, there are 3 sections. The budget itself is approved in accord, or is put together in accordance with General Statute 159 and the Local Budget and Fiscal Control Act. There are 3 sections in your binder. The first is the section that is the continuation budget. That contains financial information and narrative descriptions of the programs and services that the county provides. And it's the narrative sections are there to help create and explain the purpose and function of the different departments and programs. So when someone picks up the budget document, it's just not a math document. It's an educational document. We want people to be able to read and understand what programs and functions the county does, and then from the financial aspect, what it pays for and where your tax dollars go and what services are provided from that. So you have in there in the financial summaries, you have line item details, which you can review. So we drill it down to the line item level in here, and you can see prior year and a couple years before. And then the second section is a section where it has 29 general fund and 18 enterprise fund service expansions. We call them service expansions because it's something new or different than what you did last year. The continuation budget proposes to provide for the county the exact same services that were provided in the prior year. That's why we call it continuation. Service expansion, it can be an expansion, it can be a contraction. We've always called them service expansions. Some folks call them decision packages, whatever you want to call them, but we've traditionally called them service expansions. It's something that's new or different to the prior year budget. We pull those out separately so that the board gets to look at those. Typically, department heads will come in and pitch those, why they may need some new program or want to do something differently than they've done in the past. And the board will take those individually, look at them, and then make your decision about that. Because ultimately, this budget, once we hand it off to you to not as your budget, to get done for your constituents, what you want to get done for your constituents. And then the other piece of that is if you have an outside agency who is either asking for some additional funding above what they got last year, or if you have a new agency that comes in and requests new funding, you'll see those in the service expansion. The third section is the fee manual. Sometimes that gets kind of by the wayside, but the fee manual is in there for you to look at. There's some changes in the fee manual this year. In fact, one of the things that came up at the board meeting the other night about a renaming of a road, not just the initial naming, because all that's taken care of in the subdivision work, but a renaming. So a road's already named and somebody comes in and says, hey, I want to rename this road. We've proposed a change in the fee manual that says that anybody who does that has got to pay for the cost of the advertising. Because advertising, unfortunately, can be very expensive for us. It can be $100 or more. So if it's something that you want done, then you ought to pay for that instead of it being borne by the general tax dollars of the government. So that's what you'll see in the fee manual, some changes related to that. And it's all about being able to try to recoup some of the costs that are associated with direct impacts for services. The budget is balanced and it's prepared in accordance with the policies and procedures outlined in the Local Budget and Fiscal Control Act. So as you know, our budget process traditionally begins at the planning retreat. That occurred this year on February the 7th, where the board got together. We talked about where we stood currently with this year's budget, what our department heads anticipated was coming in the upcoming year, what they may have heard from their associations with legislative goals that may be going on. So to try to help the board understand what you may be looking out for in the upcoming year. We distributed budget packets in late February to internal departments and to external requesters. Those packets came back to the finance department in late March. We had individual meetings with our department heads in early April, and we finalized those budget requests. And in that, we go through those budgets line item by line item and sit down with our department managers and look at where they are, what they need, what their expenditures have been, and try to make sure we're honed in on where we need to be. There are cuts that are made. Sometimes there are some expansions that are made because, if there's, obviously this year with some inflation, we may have miscalculated on a utility bill or something, and we want to make sure that they're able to do what they need to do, but we don't want that to be too excessive. So the property tax information comes in later, and we do that. Folks always say, well, why do you do your expenditures before you do your revenues? Shouldn't you figure out how much money you have before you start figuring how much you're going to spend? And that would be nice, but the problem is we don't get final revenue numbers until late in April, just by the way it's set up. The tax piece of that for business personal property, businesses are allowed to file an extension, which means it's later for us to get that information. And for us to be able to get that information to you, we need to go ahead and get working on our expenditure side. So we start the expenditures. We know where we are. We generally have a good feel for where we think our revenues will come in. And then at the end of April, late April, we're able to finalize those revenues, usually the first week of May, and make a good determination on where we think we're going to be. So tonight is when by statute, I'm required to present to you a budget message. And in that budget message, it's supposed to talk about newer, different things that are occurring in the budget, changes that occur, and be a template for you to look at and be able to understand where we are and where we're going. So tonight we're doing that. You'll start budget workshops this week. It starts Thursday with general fund. We'll start there and we'll go through the departments individually with the board. You have another budget workshop on Tuesday, May the 16th, where we'll catch the rest of the departments in general fund and start the enterprise funds. The 21st, we'll finish up with enterprise funds, and then that's Thursday, we're doing service expansions. And then the 23rd is the 23rd, I believe, is service expansion night. And then you'll have your regular June meeting on the 3rd, June the 3rd. Now, historically, we've had the budget to a point where you've already had your last budget meeting before we get to the June meeting because of some requests to push some things back this year. We're a little bit further behind on that. So you'll actually have your public hearing for the budget, for the recommended budget, and for your budget at the June 3rd regular meeting. And then on June the 4th, you'll have your final work session where you can finalize the budget. So it works in a good manner in that you'll be able to hear from the public, and then you'll have a final work session where you may want to make some tweaks to the budget. And then there's a special called meeting on June the 10th, that next Monday, where our anticipation is you would adopt the budget that night. You don't have to. You can push it off, but you can't push it past June 30th. You got to have a budget adopted by June 30th. Technically, I always say that, but with the caveat that technically you don't. You could pass a continuing budget like the General Assembly's done in the past, but that's terribly painful, and you probably don't want to do that. And you want to make sure you get your budget adopted before June 30th. So as we talk about our goals, in our goals, we continue to rely upon financial plans and systems in the preparation of the budget. We want to make sure that we're not just pulling things out of the air, that we have financial plans and we look at those to make sure we know where we are. We conservatively estimate revenues and expenditures to avoid expectations of performance that are not realistic. Unfortunately, you see that sometimes in budgets. Well, it's easier for me to tweak the revenues and say, oh, I'm going to get this much more money in on revenues. And it's easy to balance a budget that way without doing the real hard work. So we try to conservatively estimate those revenues and expenditures to make sure that we're not just pulling something out of the air. We want to make sure that at the end of the year, our budget has performed the way we anticipate it's going to perform. We also try to create an atmosphere where efforts to spend down, and I put that in quotes, spend down, during the fiscal year are discouraged. We are not the federal government. If you work for the federal government, it's pretty clear. If you don't spend your money, you don't get it next year. To some extent, that's the way it is in state government as well. So you see managers during the year trying to spend money, because if you don't spend it, you don't get it next year. That is not what we do in this budget, and we discourage that, and we have a pretty tight rein on where our folks are spending. Now, that means that what we don't want folks to do is at the end of the year, go do silly buying just so that they think they'll get it next year. If there are things that departments need, we make sure they are able to purchase those for the operations. But if we find, as we review budgets, that they've got too much in that, we'll bring it back some. We don't want to penalize them, but we also don't want them thinking that they've got to spend all their money just so they'll get it next year. We try to present a budget that reevaluates all expenditures and allows for policy review and potential service reduction or expansions based on policy directives. Obviously, the budget is a recommended budget to you as we talk about what it takes to provide the same services we provided last year in the upcoming year. Your policy directives are where the budget changes and where you want it to be to get done for your constituents what you want. And then finally, to provide an analysis of county government cost centers to more clearly demonstrate where general fund tax dollars are being spent and what services are being provided with those dollars. That's why it's an educational document as well as a financial document. You should be able to look at our budget and say, where are my tax dollars being spent? What value am I getting for that? And what programs are being provided? We think that this budget does that. So overall, looking at the budget, we've been fortunate. The economic conditions in Beaufort County continue to be strong, and they have been strong over the last couple of years. Sales tax revenue have shown strong growth, with returns reaching record levels over the last couple of years. However, the impact of rising inflation and the efforts of the Federal Reserve to cool that have worked to plateau our sales tax revenues. We knew that. We've talked about that for the last 2 years. We've said the shoe's going to drop. Eventually it will plateau, and eventually it may turn down. We believe we are now at the point where it has plateaued, and we budget and forecast with that in mind. On the flip side of that, interest rates have been strong. So if you had money in the bank, you were doing well. But we believe that with inflation cooling a bit, with the Federal Reserve's actions, they've signaled that they look to make some rate cuts. They may not make them as fast as they said they were going to make them, but those policy decisions on rate will impact, obviously, our interest earnings over the next year. So we want to watch those very closely. So down to the meat of this, the recommended budget maintains the county ad valorem tax rate at 62.5 cents per $100 worth of valuation. As you'll recall, back in fiscal year 21-22, this board cut the budget by 1 cent, cut the tax rate by 1 cent, and this is the 4th straight year that we've maintained that level of taxes, despite the increased inflation pressures that we've faced over the last couple of years. At this assumed rate, we'll collect about $40.5 million in property tax revenue. The recommended budget maintains all services and programs that were in the prior year. And again, that's done despite the fact of rising inflation, increased healthcare insurance cost, increased cost all around. The recommended budget does include a 3.5% cost of living increase. Now, that's something a little different for us. The CPI that we look at, the South Region CPI for the 12-month period as of March was 3.8%. We don't get April's until May 15th. And historically, the recommended budget has not included a COLA. We've put that in as a service expansion. This board has decided whether they wanted to do that or not. But you've also worked really hard over the last few years to strengthen the pay plan and classification plan for the county by conducting market studies, adjusting rates as needed, and maintaining those rates against inflation by including cost of living increases. And this is shown to be beneficial in recruiting and maintaining qualified employees. So including a COLA in the recommended budget works to continue those efforts. So that's different, but that's what we've done this year. The FY 24-25 recommended general fund budget is $75.2 million. That's 3.9% greater than last year's budget. Now remember, that's 3.9% greater, but our CPI for the last 12 months has been 3.8%. So we're 1/10 of 1% over that. The recommended budget increases the K-12 public school system funding over last year's prior level by 3.6% for both current expense and capital outlay items. When we developed the budget, the projected CPI was 3.6%, and that's what we said to the school system. 3.6% is what we're going to lay in. You know, they're working on their budget. Actually, the legislative timeline on that's in statute gives them even more time to work on that before they give it to us. So we're always kind of in that middle point about where they're going to finally end up being and where we're going to be. So in doing that, we figured 3.6% was the CPI. We added that to the current expense and to the capital expense for them. Now, overall, there's a little difference there when you look at the percentages because the funding for the school resource officers is now not in the schools that we were sending to them, but it's pulled out and it goes under the sheriff's office. So you'll see a change there. The community college has an increase, and it meets their funding request, but it also includes a $500,000 appropriation, one-time capital appropriation for a trades building, for construction of a trades building that was to be matched up with $500,000 from the state under bond funds. And that project was approved by this board in fiscal year 23-24, so we've included it in the budget. The recommended budget continues to fund the CIP, the Capital Improvements Fund, which this board put in place in the 19-20 budget, where you took 1 penny of tax revenue and set it aside to do capital improvements and make sure your facilities were strong. This year, we've done something a little different as well. We've proposed that $78,000 from that fund and that 1 penny this year, projected from the 1 penny for this year, be used to fund a contract position, a project manager contract position, not a FTE, but a contract position, so that we can engage a project manager to come in and help us take care of some of our projects that have lingered a little bit. We're a little bit behind on some of those CIP projects, and we need to go ahead and expedite them. So this is a way to do that, and we think it's a good way to do it. The recommended budget maintains prior year EMS rates in all districts, and it maintains the prior year fire tax in both of the south side fire districts. There are 2 fire districts on the south side of the river, and then there's the north side fire district. The budget does recommend and includes a 1 cent rate increase for the north side fire district. That's made up of 10 volunteer fire departments on the north side of the river. There is a general one tax that covers fire tax that covers the entire north side. Years ago, and I only know this by reading the minutes, there was some concern expressed by the board and by the public when there were the 2 fire districts on the south side. There were 2 on the north side as well, and the other fire departments were asking to have their own fire district and tax. And the board said, we're not sure we want to put a whole lot of districts in. Let's do a north side district. So that north side district covers all the fire departments on the north side of the river, and they break up those funds amongst themselves to fund their operations. Those 10 fire chiefs got together on the north side and said, we're struggling with operational costs and especially with capital cost, and we need a 1 cent increase in our fire tax. So we've included that in our recommended budget. The recommended budget also increases the solid waste fee. Now, this is not general fund, this is enterprise fund. So it increases the solid waste fee by $8 to offset the cost of increasing solid waste disposal and inflation. And it also, out of that increase, that was $5 essentially to cover inflation and additional disposal costs. one of these days, maybe folks are going to not throw away everything they have. It just continues to grow and to grow. And we've become we've become a disposable society. We throw things away quite often. And it's designed that way. Packaging, marketing, use it and throw it away. And we've seen that in our increase in our tonnage, and then also in the cost of disposing. So that was $5 to do that. The additional $3, in fact, this board voted on that recently, would increase, those additional $3 increase would open the Republic Services Transfer Station on Flanders Filter Road for 4 hours every Saturday, so that construction and demolition debris could be deposited at the transfer station by residential customers. Currently, the transfer station is closed on the weekend, so, and the county doesn't accept C&D or commercial and demolition debris at our convenience sites. So people have struggled to be able to do that. They either have to take time off or do something different. So the board decided meeting before last, to do that. Actually, it was last meeting, I believe. So we've put that in the budget, and the caveat was that it would go for 6 months, and we do a review on it for the board and let you know what was going on as to whether you continued that. And in the budget, we've shown that for the entire year. We would obviously have to show that for the entire year. But the board does have, a 6-month review period, which you want to look at that and determine whether you want to keep on doing it. But that would keep the site, the transfer station open on Saturday, every Saturday for 4 hours. Now, with that, if you go to the transfer station, you're still going to pay individually for disposal of C&D. It's not something the county pays for. Water fund, the recommended budget increases water rates by 3%. We did not have an increase last year, but inflationary costs inflationary pressures have made it such that we need to do that. So we skipped last year, but this year we are recommending a 3% increase, and all the rates are equal across all the districts. We continue to maintain the administrative charge to enterprise funds that help offset the cost to the general fund for services that we're providing. General fund employees are providing to those enterprise funds, so there's a transfer back to the general fund for those services. The recommended budget appropriates $700,000 in fund balance this year. Those are one-time expenditures. We always try to make our fund balance expenditures one-time expenditures. Fund balance money is one-time money, and we try to spend it in one-time expenditures. So out of that $700,000, the biggest chunk of it is $500,000 that the board approved for the Beaufort County Community College Trades Building, and then $200,000 for the Workers' Compensation Reserve Fund that we set up that you transfer funds into every year that has helped us drive down those workers' compensation costs. So the general fund, again, $75.2 million. The total taxable valuation that we're anticipating for this year is $6.5 billion with a B, $6.5 billion. And that's made up of $5.8 billion in real and personal property and $682 million in motor vehicles. We project property tax rate collection at 98.61%. and at 100% for motor vehicle taxes. You remember the tax and tag piece that was put in place many years ago that allows us to capture those funds before you get your registration. So we budget those at 100%. The local government Budget and Fiscal Control Act allows us to use the audited fiscal year 22-23 collection rate as our projected collection rate, and that rate was 98.61% for real property. The estimated total real property value is up 2.69% or $154 million from prior year. So there's some growth in real property. You'll see on page 4 of the message the table that shows where we were 8 years ago in the revaluation cycle, and we were at 55 cents then. We're at 62.5 cents now, and you've been that way since your tax cut in 21-22. The next piece is where we talk about where Beaufort County stands with its effective tax rate. and its effective tax rate is something that's calculated by a sales assessment ratio study that the North Carolina Department of Revenue does every year. Now, they do that in an effort to equalize public service company valuations, because we don't value those. The state of North Carolina values those. They value utilities and they value things that make up public service companies. So they look at that every year to determine what the sales ratio is. So sales ratios greater than 1 indicate that the assessed values are greater than market value, and ratios less than 1 indicate that the assessed values are less than market value. So typically in a revaluation year, you're trying to peg market rate. So then you look back at your sales and you say, okay, we're there typically. So it's about 1, which means what we have it assessed for is what it's selling for. Now, historically, you see growth in the market. We peg our numbers and they stick for a certain number of years until we do revaluation again. So what happens is our number that sticks and the market grows. So that's why you'll see the sales ratio go down below 1. It just means that the market's selling for more than what we have it valued for. Now, you saw, unfortunately, a few years ago when we had the Great Recession, that it flipped on us, where the market took a crash. And because we hadn't changed, because we were in our revaluation cycle, our numbers stayed solid, the market went the other way. And there was a lot of angst in that, and that was unusual. That usually doesn't happen. Personal property usually appreciates and doesn't depreciate. At least that's where you hope it does. But if you look at and take the sales ratio, so the sales ratio looks at where that is, and it kind of equalizes everybody across the board, because everybody's in a different year across the state in their revaluation cycle. So the sales ratio helps us equalize that and make it be apples to apples. So when you take the effective tax rate, or the effective tax rate is made up of the tax rate times the sales ratio. And if you look at that across all 100 counties, Beaufort County, and this is a study that's done by the Department of Revenue, so we don't have any, our finger's not on the scales on that. So it shows that Beaufort County has an effective tax rate of 0.4118 or 41.18 cent, which ranks us the 19th lowest in all 100 counties across North Carolina. There are 81 that have higher effective rates than we do, and 18 that have lower rates. You'll see our neighbors, around us, what their 23-24 tax rate was, what their ratio was, and what their effective rate is, and where they rank out in 100 counties across the state. So you should be, I'm proud, and I hope you're very proud of where we stand when you look apples to apples across the state of North Carolina with tax rates. We're pretty dang good. Our projected sales tax revenues are down about 1.76% from the prior year. We talked about that. Sales tax growth over the last few years appears to have plateaued, and that's been because of the Federal Reserve efforts to try to combat inflation. We knew that was going to happen. We saw it coming. We talked about it for a couple of years. What we wanted to try to make sure we did in our prior budgets was not outspend ourselves and say, oh, well, it increased by 10% last year. It's going to increase by 15% this year, and keep on and keep on. But you have to be careful in looking down the road. We don't have a crystal ball, but you see those things coming, and we hope that we anticipate, and we hope that we've adjusted for that. Intergovernmental revenues are expected to increase by about $715,000. And that's due to an increase in state and federal funding. We have a pot of money that comes in that's state and federal funding that we call intergovernmental revenues. Our license fees and other general fund revenues are projected to be up almost $300,000. Now, that's mostly related to the anticipated receipt of state school resource officers grants, because the sheriff's office is resuming those. So the way it's set up is any of those grants that come for SROs, instead of flowing to the school system, will flow back to us, and that's where those funds would come in. Investment earnings are projected to reach about $1.8 million, obviously due to the higher inflation rates, higher interest rates. Now, again, we talked about the Fed signaling that They were going to look to cut rates if they got inflation to where they wanted to be. They're still not where they wanted to be. It's come down significantly, but it's not where they've said they wanted to be, so they've stopped, or they haven't advanced that rate cut, which they said they were going to do, but they're still making noises about doing that maybe later this year or at least the first of next year. So we're conscious of that, and we've tried to adjust for that. But of course, that performance in those policies and those monetary policies will have a big influence on whether our interest rates go up or down, our interest returns go up or down. $700,000 in fund balance, we've talked about that. A little bit more in fund balance. As of June 30th of '23, the audited general fund balance was $32.4 million. So that's what the auditor said you had in general fund balance as of the close of business, June 30th of '23. What we anticipate at the close of this fiscal year is that the unassigned general fund balance will be $25.2 million, or 35.42% of revenue, of expenditures. Now, this reduction is due to the board's movement of $10 million out of fund balance into a reserve fund for the school needs-based grant match for the construction of the new pre-K through 3 school. So that comes out of fund balance and goes into a special reserve fund that is going to be used to match up against that. So when you take that 10 million out and the other, it puts the estimated fund balance percentage right at the 35% where this board has a policy of wanting to be. So we're projecting 35.42. Your fund balance policy that was adopted by this board is 35%, so you're right there at it. The chart you see on the revenue side shows again that our major revenue sources are property tax at 54, almost 55%, and then sales and other taxes at 19.6. So the majority of our funding is from property tax, with sales tax coming in second. On the expenditure side, on general fund, general government cost centers, excluding debt and transfers, are increased by about 1% overall from last year. Now, those had inflationary pressures just like all of them, but we were able to help drive that down a little bit by a reduction in our property and liability insurance premiums that this board approved last meeting, by increasing our deductible. And then we also decreased our contingency funding by about 50%. Human services cost centers are expected to increase by about 4.5%, or almost $900,000, and that's driven by the projected program increases, mainly at DSS, but also in the health department. Medicaid expansion and more programs that are going on at DSS are driving those, and that's just part of what we have to deal with and absorb. Community cost centers, those overall have decreased by about 0.6%, and that's driven by some one-time funding that occurred in last year's budget that's not occurring this time. Educational cost centers we talked about, overall, they're up 3.5%. As you look at both of them combined, just the entire educational cost center, K-12 funding is flat. We talked about that. It's 3.6% increase in both current expense and capital, but it's also reduced by the SRO funding amount that was going to the schools. So we now show that coming back under the sheriff's office in fiscal year 24-25. Community college is funded, it's about 21% above prior year, but that's due to the $500,000 one-time expenditure set aside for construction of a trades building that this board has already approved. Public safety cost centers are up 9.8% overall, and that main driver is the increased operational cost in the sheriff's office due to moving those SROs back underneath the sheriff's office. So you moved it out of schools, moved it to the sheriff's office. So you see a decrease on one side and an increase on the other side. You'll see again for our expenditure side where we're spending our money, and historically, I would say to you that this is pretty general. This is pretty standard across every county in North Carolina. Education is traditionally number one expenditure. We're spending 31% of our budget. 31% of our budget goes to education. 28% of our budget goes to human services, DSS, health department, human services programs, and then 26% of our budget goes to public safety. And I would would guess that if you look at that across the state, you'll see every other county in North Carolina about the same way. Education is traditionally always going to be the highest expenditure. And then you'll see public safety and human services flip, but they're traditionally pretty close together. And human services usually comes in second. Last piece of this are the enterprise funds. Enterprise funds account for those operations that are financed and operated in a manner similar to a private business, where the intent is that the cost of providing those goods and services to the general public on a continuing basis is financed or recovered primarily from user fees. So you're not using general fund tax dollars, you're using the costs, or you're charging for the use of those services, whether it's gallons of water or whether it's solid waste. And those are our two enterprise funds, water fund and solid waste fund. In the water fund, there's a recommended budget of about $9.2 million. Again, we talked about a 3% increase in rates due to inflation, and those rates being uniform now across all districts. We continue the 10-year CIP plan that was established in fiscal year 18-19 to be able to have good financial plans on how we maintain that system. The expenditures in the amount of $150,000 are recommended for capital, and we funded contingency at $126,000. Solid waste budget is recommended at $4.6 million. Again, we talked about the increase of $8 to a total of $188 to offset the cost of increasing solid waste, and then opening of the transfer station on Saturdays. We continue the administrative fees, and then we are continuing with the engineering studies and for the proposed mega sites. I think we're going to have some movement on that very shortly. We're excited about that. So in general, just to summarize the budget, it continues all county-provided services and operations, and does this while maintaining the ad valorem rate of 62.5 cents per $100 evaluation, despite the impact of record high inflation and increasing demands for service. The general fund budget is only 0.1% higher than the reported CPI for the prior 12 months. The budget increases the fee associated with solid waste by $8. We talked about that. And the budget increases water rates by 3%. The budget does include a 3.5% cost of living based on the 12-month prior CPI of 3.8%. And again, the performance of our budget is obviously going to be impacted by how the economy plays out as a whole. And that includes world economies, national economies, and local economies. Inflation has started to slow due to the efforts of the Federal Reserve. That impacts us on several ways. Our sales tax have plateaued and we anticipate will remain that way, if not decrease. And our interest earnings, although they have been strong due to the higher interest rates put in place by the Fed to help combat inflation, we anticipate that the Fed, and it's signaling that it's going to look to cut rates again. They said maybe 3 cuts by the end of the year. I'm not sure they're going to get to 3 cuts by the end of the year, but they'll probably start cutting rates sometime. And we got 12 months of a budget to look at that. So we've tempered our interest earnings based on that. Every year we put together a budget, and we have a lot of folks who work really, really hard to do that. And it is a tremendous effort to put a budget together. Anita Radcliffe, who's our finance director, and her staff do an absolutely fantastic job in putting that budget together and making it an informative and functional document that serves as a management tool and an outline for which you as a board can debate policy and decide what it is you want to do with the budget. And I'm very grateful for they put in some long, hard hours of work to do that. Our department managers likewise do the same thing. They did a great job of analyzing and compiling budgets that met the expectations they were given. We always talk to them about making sure you are where you need to be for your operations, but not being above that. And they've done well. And I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to work with all of them every year. I appreciate your continuing to allow me to do what I do. Look forward to having further discussions with the board as we move through this budget process again. Happy to take any questions you have about the presentation. or otherwise, happy to have our next conversation on Thursday night.
Any comment or question? In trying to look for where we're going to be on Thursday night, do you and Anita want to take a guess how far we'll go and or what we'll be looking at?
Yes, sir. So historically, what we've tried to do is we've tried to get through, we start on the table of contents page, and what we try to do is get through education on the expenditure side on the first night. And then we'll pick up public safety the next night. We'll get through that, and we'll talk about special revenue funds, so that will be the next Tuesday. And then the Thursday week, we would be in service expansion. So our goal is on the first night, Thursday night, is to get through general government, human services, community services, and education departments, or funding sources. Funding.
Okay. Any other comment before we recess for Thursday night at 5 o'clock?
At 5 o'clock, yes, sir.
Okay.
I will not be Thursday.
You will not be here. Okay.
I will not be here Thursday. So the whole right will be gone.
Glad you recognize where you should be.
I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
Okay. Well, we'll see you on Thursday night.